now. And I will put it up on YouTube, on our CASI YouTube channel tomorrow. So, all right, I'm going to stop my video. Melon, I'll turn it over to you to unmute your microphone. And I will share my presentation screen from here.
Excellent. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining tonight or this morning or wherever you find yourself in the world. Thanks for the introduction, Jeff. All right. So, Jeff, if you can possibly mute the background noise. Sorry, everybody. I'm just going to do some muting so I have some room to think in my head. That's all right. And I'm going to unmute myself. Can everyone hear me? I can see your faces. Awesome. You guys are wicked. Thanks so much. And like Jeff was saying, if you have some questions, type them into the chat. We'll probably address those questions towards the end. So we can flow through the material because it's structured in a way that some of the questions hopefully will answer themselves as we roll through the presentation. So the idea is we'll see if we can roll through that first. My name is Melon J. I'm a member, as Jeff introduced, of the CASI National Technical Team. I'm also a registered massage therapist, and I have an undergraduate in biomedical sciences. I've taught anatomy and physiology at a college level, and I'm really passionate about taking that stuff into snowboarding. And so tonight's presentation is on the physics and biomechanics of snowboarding. And Jeff, if you want to scroll to the next slide there. This is actually presentation is taken directly from the level 2 workshop. So if you look in the level 2 course guide, you'll see this workshop, and the reference for this is in the CASI reference guide, pages 137 to 150. Don't bust out your CASI reference guide. We don't need that tonight. But all we need to know is just these 5 questions, and they're going to form the structure of our presentation today. So the 5 questions that are in the CASI reference guide ask us to describe the center of mass, describe the base of support. Question 3 asks us, how can a snowboarder aid balance or increase stability while riding? Question 4 says, describe the differences in body position on the toe side versus heel side edges. And question 5 is, how do novices versus advanced riders utilize range of motion as they progress in skill? So the questions go from sort of like a foundation level, short and simple, to a little bit more complicated, but hopefully we can use the first couple questions, like this one, to build ourselves a foundation to answer those questions at the end. So the first slide here, thanks, Jeff, asks us to describe the center of mass. And so if you look at the slide ahead of us, the definition at the bottom is right out of the textbook. It's the center of mass is the mass of an object around which an imaginary point around which all of the mass is evenly distributed. And so in people, different body types have different relative locations. So you can see in the picture on the slide that the center of mass of that rider is right sort of in the middle, right around the belly button, or a couple of centimeters above. And depending on where you carry your mass, up high or down low, that mass can move like forward or lower in your body. And it's a dynamic system because at any point in time, you can raise your center of mass by like lifting heavier objects up, or bring it down lower by moving massy objects like your arms and shoulders around in the system. And I think that's the really big thing that I'd like to start to think about is not just like our systems as a static idea, but the center of mass is something that's actually quite movable and changeable. And I think what I'd like to propose first off is a key concept is not just about the center of mass itself, but this idea of a center line that runs from the center of mass down to the base of support, which you're standing on. And this center line really has a lot of implications to how we use our center of mass when we snowboard. So the closer basically the center of mass is to this center line, or the closer all of the mass objects are, so our limbs, shoulders, hips, butt, are closer to the center line, nice and tight and close, the more stable and the more easy it is to engage also not just being stable, but also engage dynamic balancing. Because when your limbs are all sort of nice and close and your joints are at optimal neutral length, then you have more of a possibility to do dynamic balancing because the joints are in a neutral position and muscles work way better when they're in a neutral or a middle of their range. So hopefully that gets us and starts to lay the framework for what we're going to talk about in our later questions, rather than just answering simply center of mass. So let's flick on to the next slide and answer question number 2. Now, question 2 asks us to describe the base of support. And similar idea, it's really easy to just simply talk about the base of support in the textbook definition at the bottom, which is the location on a body or object where most of the weight is supported. The larger the base of support, the more stable the object will be. Okay, that works great if you're a lamp. But as a snowboarder, it's a little bit more dynamic. So instead of just answering this question simply, which I've seen really often, what's the base of support? Oh, the snowboard. Instead of thinking about like your mass on top of the base of support, let's think about the base of support and then the snow underneath and actually what that contact point is looking like. So if you look at the picture here on the slide with the base of support, we could say, oh, the base of support's the snowboard. But if we actually look at it, no, the base of support is where the snow underneath is contacting the snowboard. And it's actually a good picture because it's not evenly distributed along the entire length of the snowboard. The nose and the tail of that board are off the ground. So there's no support happening. But the board's also quite flat onto the snow. So there's quite a bit of contact at the base with the snow. And so the base of support could be described as between the feet and the majority of the base towards the heel edge. So I think that's a really important thing to talk about. And this has a lot to do with our idea about having equal pressure along the edge when we're snowboarding. We teach our students to have a centered position instead of just being on one foot or the other, back foot or front foot pivot. We teach our students to maybe get a little bit of cowboy knees happening, to flatten out their feet just a little bit more and have pressure along the entire edge. What's it do for them? Helps to increase the size of their base of support. And we know from the textbook definition, a bigger base of support makes things more stable. So sort of 2 key concepts with base of support to take a look at is where's the mass distributed along the edge? And then how much of that edge is actually in contact with the snow, to think about what the base of support actually is, rather than just saying, oh, the base of support when you're snowboarding is your snowboard. How do you get more stable? Buy a bigger snowboard. Use more of the snowboard you've got. So hopefully that lays the framework for our next question, which is question 3. Actually, our next slide is just a little bit about movement patterns. So just diving into center of mass being a dynamic system rather than something that's just simple and stable. So this is a basic piece of human movement. So in human movement, when we're walking or running or doing anything, we actually move our center of mass away from our base of support. So by moving the center of mass forward in front of the base of support, we actually create a falling force. And then the next thing we do is we swing our foot underneath and we reestablish the base of support in front of that mass, giving us a step forward. And then we do it again. We destabilize, send our center of mass forward and take another step forward. So walking is actually a really efficient way of moving because instead of engaging a ton of muscles, we actually engage a lot of falling force and create this physics when we walk, when we run. And it's a really efficient and familiar pattern. And we actually do this in snowboarding as well. So pop onto the next slide. So when we're snowboarding, we teach this really early. When we teach it right away in pendulum. When we teach our students to do pendulum for the first time, we go from a really stable position to getting our students to somehow shift their mass slightly in one direction or the other. Whether or not that's applying pressure, or in the old days, we talked about putting more weight on one foot. Naturally, we'll have people look in that direction because just like walking or running, you look there and you shift your center of mass where you want to go. We talk about angling anything or flattening off a foot, which puts more of our mass over top of that one flattened object. And that yields us that sort of, nose first, tail first direction that we get in pendulum. We also keep exploring this when we talk about moving the center of mass slightly more downhill. That flattens the board off and gives us a garland or a beginner turn. So if we think about teaching those things, we're teaching our students to create a slight destabilization in their center of mass to create force when they're riding. And then we can also teach them that this works with board physics as well. When we have our students actually want to slow down and stop, say they're doing a heel edge J turn, we're going to get them to move their center of mass uphill and inside of the turn. And that's the first time they start to experience the side cut of their snowboard coming around to catch them and working to reestablish the base of support rather than their foot stepping around. They're learning snowboard technology, but it's this harnessing the same physics that we use as humans every day in walking and running. It's create force with center of mass and then catch up with the base of support. And it's a really efficient and effective way of creating locomotion. Hopefully this is all making sense. If you have questions, please type them in, but we're going to take a look at those at the end. So we're going to use what we learned now, and let's take a look at the next slide, and we'll answer question 3, which is, how can a snowboarder aid balance or increase stability while riding? So when I do this presentation, when I'm running a level 2, the number one thing that I hear from candidates is that get the center of mass closer to the base of support. It works, but only to a point. So being lower is only effective if you're within the effective range of your muscles, because creating more stability by getting really, really, really low can affect your active balancing process, because muscles work best when they're not completely out of range. If you're using all of your muscular strength and you're completely maxing out your joints to get really, really tiny, there's not going to be any movement and not going to be any active balancing. So instead of thinking about getting lower, the best thing you can do is to keep more of your mass, so arms, shoulders, and hips, close to the center line. Not because it makes you more stable, but because it actually increases your ability to do more active balancing, because your joints aren't maxed out completely, arms aren't out here, hips aren't all the way back. So it's the active process that's really important. Also, considering what we just learned about like fundamental movement patterns, actually creating a little bit more instability with the center of mass is a really effective and efficient way to generate force. So center of mass should be something that we want to actually be able to use to destabilize slightly and control to be able to create mass. So the better answer is on the next slide, which is a more relevant way is to increase the size of the base of support. So increase that contact patch of your snowboard with the snow. So number one is going to be that idea about balance along the entire working edge, which is really important. That's why we try and encourage two-footed pivot. We stay away from a front foot pivot because it's really unstable. The back half of the board's just sliding all over. Tactics that use putting pressure on the outsides of the feet to pressure along the snowboard is going to be way more effective. The other really effective way to increase stability is actually through edge angle. So if you take a look at the two pictures of the snowboards on the left is right up on a really, really high edge angle. And so it means that there's actually very little of the snowboard in contact with the snow. So there's only like that thin red strip that's giving stability. By lowering the edge angle within effective conditions or effective range, lowering the edge angle allows the snowboarder to ride along or stand on not just the metal edge, but like, you know, a chunk of the base right beside the edge. And so this massively increases the amount of contact with the snow, and then really, really increases stability in the base of support. And we teach our beginners to do this, right? We teach our beginners in quick ride, whoa, that's too much edge angle. Just a little bit of edge angle. Just keep just as much as you need that you don't catch the edge and go over, right? We get them to feel that there can be a larger contact patch on the snow. But I think this is also something that's really relevant and important as we approach high-end riding as well. If we're in moguls, if we're in trees, if we're in, you know, challenging conditions that are going to destabilize us, a great way to start improving our stability when we're riding is to actually ride with the lowest edge angle possible to achieve performance. Something to think about when we're on snow next. The other thing that we can really see this in is in snow conditions. We all love riding powder. It's amazing. It feels so good and you feel so stable, right? Because you have a massive base of support. The powder just builds up under your base and banks and creates this contact patch all the way through. And that's what makes powder riding so stable and effortless. Conversely, if you're riding really icy or really, really firm conditions, you can't get much more than your really razor sharp edge, and there's a very small contact patch. And that's why if anything goes wrong, you're destabilized so quickly. So things to think about in terms of snow conditions, edge angle, pressure along the edge, thinking about our base of support a lot more as a way to increase stability, rather than thinking about our position on the snowboard. Hopefully that answers the question and gets some wheels turning. Let's take a look at question number 4. So now we start to think about the differences between body position, between the toe side and the heel side edge. And again, one of the answers that I hear a lot of is that there's one more joint. Okay, there is not one more joint. You don't just have an extra ankle. Technically, there are 33 more joints if we run up the foot from the toes where they contact the toe edge all the way up past the ankle. So no, this one more joint thing is not going to work for me. And really, if you're on your heel edge, you actually have a lot to do with the ankles and the other like 33 joints through your foot, even when you're on your heel edge, even though the heels themselves are contacting the snow. The reason why is that all of the key joints of our muscles of snowboarding actually run across all of the joints, multiple joints. So your muscle attached sometimes up by your thigh, run across your knee that work to flex your knee, and then run through your foot and attach down into your foot or even by your toes. And so we can't just say that, oh, well, we're moving the ankle around, because the muscles themselves will cross the ankle on both heel edge and toe edge. Same with the muscles of the hips, and knee are really connected. So thinking about muscular systems, most of those muscles cross 2 or more joints. And I think that's starting to lay the framework of this idea of joints that aren't at end range, so not maxing out our joints at all, because our muscles cross multiple joints, especially in our lower body. And so looking with that idea a little bit more between toe side and heel side edge, they're actually a little bit more similar than they are different. So heel side and toe side edge, to be effective, what we want to do is we want to keep more of the rider's mass, again, closer to the center line between the center of mass and the base of support, even as they move through the range of movement, right? And this allows for all of the joints that those muscles cross to be in a neutral position so that they can work effectively to be able to create the destabilization that we need to be effective snowboarders. So it's pretty easy when you're cruising along a blue run, as the 2 riders at the bottom of this GIF are. You can see both riders are really effectively using the center of mass, just rocking from one side to the other, destabilizing and allowing the base of support, the snowboard, to catch up to them through effective use of the side cut of their snowboards. Their joints are all in a really neutral range because they don't need it, because the slope's pretty mellow. But this is something to think about when we're looking at riders at this level, is to think about, hey, are all of their joints in an effective neutral range? And are they keeping most of their mass close to the center line? And if you look at these 2 riders, hopefully performing a level 1 standard turn, then we've got that answer. Let's take a look at how this applies to snowboarders at more advanced level when we have to move through a little bit more of a range of motion. And again, thinking more about the similarities and thinking more about the biomechanics being similar rather than different. Let's take a look at the next slide. So as riders get more advanced, they have to use more of their range of motion. However, for both toe side and heel side, again, the whole goal is to try and keep more of the mass, so shoulders, arms, hips, bum, and knees, as close to the center line as possible. And doing that, even within our range of flexion extension, that no joint, in particular, no one joint, is ever maxed out in either flexion or extension, right? We've all seen the the, you know, new riders that are cruising down and they've got, you know, rigid legs that are completely maxed out, but they're bent all the way over at the hip. You know, joints that are maxed have no ability to adjust or make any movement patterns to do any kind of dynamic balancing. So if we look at riders here, even though they're trying to get low or trying to get aggressive, none of those joints are completely maxed out. So if we look at the rider in the heel edge position, and to prevent the joints from getting really maxed out and to keep the mass as close as possible to the center line. A couple of key points in this one are active use of the posterior chain. So in the textbook, the CASI reference guide, as well as I hear from a lot of riders that we talk about the heel edge like a wall sit. It's not exactly like a wall sit because a wall sit is going to use mostly the quads and the front of the thighs to sort of hold you up, and then you're just kind of leaning against the wall for the rest of it. But in snowboarding, thinking a little bit more about using the bum and the back of the leg muscles to flex yourself down or almost curl yourself downwards, curl the legs up and under rather than just sitting back and down. And what this offers is the ability to use to flex joints so that they're staying without their completely maxed out range. You're not getting to 90 degrees, you're not completely closing off the hip. You're using both sides of the body equally. And what that does is it draws the joints in, rather than sending the bum out one side and the knees totally straight, and then the shoulders flex forward, we see the knees go out a little bit more and the bum come in a little bit more over the base of support of this rider. And so the other thing that, you know, I think is really key to point out here too, is if we look at the rider and we look down at that back leg, you can see how much that ankle is flexing. So that ankle that we're like, oh yeah, you got ankles on toe edge. No, you got ankles to use on heel edge. Ankle flexion on the heel edge allows a lot more range of motion in the knee and allows the rider, again, to keep the bum in and closer to the center line between the center of mass and the base of support, and allows the rider to, you know, attack the snow in a position where they're much more dynamically balanced and able to adjust to what's going on and adjust to the forces that are happening. So a similar idea on the toe edge side of things. Taking a look at, again, a proportional amount of flex in the hips, knees, ankle, and low back. I've highlighted hips, ankle, and low back because these are actually really key joints that are often maxed out in riders as they're trying to advance and get a more aggressive toe edge. So oftentimes the hips are pushed all the way forward, fully extended. Oh, sorry. And as the rider flexes the knees and then collapses the ankles. And again, talking about the idea that muscles are going to cross multiple joints, big flexors of the knee cross the hip, and you know, stabilizers of the ankle as well as stabilizers of the knee cross, you know, the calf muscle crosses both the ankle and the knee. So we want to keep all of those joints a lot more neutral and in a position that that they can adjust a little bit more dynamically. So in particular here, taking a look at what's going on down at the ankle, is that the ankle should neither be completely, you know, not toes completely pointed, nor ankle completely crushed and closed. So we don't want to go into a position where the, you know, rider's all the way up on tiptoe, because again, you're maxed out and there's no range. And that's a key knee stabilizer that we're going to need later. And then we don't want to just rely on equipment and crush the boot down, because what happens in response is that the hip flexors need to come forward, and now we've got a joint that's completely maxed out and can't be used for dynamic balancing. So I'm thinking about on the toe edge where the hips are and always keeping a little bit of flex, where the ankles are and keeping them actively engaged. And what that does for us as a whole picture is it keeps our joints in a neutral position. It keeps our mass close to the center line, and it lets us dynamically adjust our base of support and our edge angle to get max stability for the performance that we're going to need. You know, only as much edge angle as you need, because it affects your stability in terms of your base of support. Hopefully this is starting to tie things together and how center of mass, base of support actually tie into some of our high-end riders. we take a look at the last of our questions.
Melon, I was just going to jump in because we had a question in the chat that applies here. So Taz wrote in the chat, when trying to increase the base of support or amount of snow contact with the snow, like in question 3, particularly on the heel side, would a rider braking at the waist hinder that process?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, big time. So braking at the waist, again, is going to completely, like, if we break at the waist, or we think about like folding over the hip joint, bringing sort of our abdomen close to our femurs, what we just done is we put our glutes in a really weak position, and we put our hip flexors in a really weak position. And with both of those muscles not able to work dynamically over that range, that's going to affect our ability to move our knees. And then our ability to move our knees affects our ability to move our ankles. So by maxing out one joint, we actually really affect our ability to make those micro adjustments farther down the chain, because the muscles don't just work on one single joint at a time. Hopefully that answers your question, Taz. And maybe someone else's. And so let me know about that one, but let's take a look at question number 5. And then we'll roll forward with any other questions or comments that people have. This kind of like ties it all together, which is a fun one. Thanks, Taz. So the question asks, how do novice versus advanced riders utilize range of motion as they progress? And so novice riders use a very limited range of motion. Expert riders have a much greater range available to them, but they only use it as needed, right? And so novice riders also will often use the range at an extreme of a joint. So in Taz's example is the idea of a beginner rider breaking at the waist, having the hip flexors completely closed. We've seen that before. We've seen exhausted beginners with their knees completely locked out as they're snowboarding along and sort of bending over with their body. They'll lock out joints. They're riding down and they've got one arm out to the side to counterbalance their hip all the way back here. And so they'll actually get into a position where you're like, you have way more range, but you've locked it way out. But they actually can't move from that position. They're just stuck at that very end range, rather than having the range that an expert rider has. And so expert riders don't or seldom reach the end range of joints. And if they do, they usually pull it back together very quickly. In a lot of cases, the reason why novice riders are maxing out those joints is that their muscular endurance is so much lower. And they're actually using that skeleton to brace or almost slouch. That poor rider with those knees all the way locked in, knocked together is exhausted, tired, and isn't in a place where they can actually have any kind of muscular endurance. Maybe they should go home and do more wall sits, maybe not. Maybe just take a lesson. Whereas expert riders, their strength and endurance is higher, and they find this real ease and effortlessness in their athletic position. An expert rider can stand all day long in, an athletic position, and it doesn't really affect them. They've got that much more muscular endurance. Novice riders will also, conversely, use a lot more effort when they're snowboarding, which may be why their endurance is lower. They use the brute force and ignorance approach to snowboarding. Just, kick it around and throw it all over the place and huck their body. It's exhausting. And so they use a lot of brute force and strength and muscular power, rather than engaging those ideas about creating falling physics or moving the center of mass and then allowing the snowboard to catch up with them, in an efficient kind of way. Whereas expert riders are way more efficient. They use effective movements of the center of mass to create force. If we think about this in the higher end riding, we talk a lot about a lateral move across the snowboard to initiate a turn. That's just the same thing as moving your center of mass forward and then allowing your base of support to catch up with you, whether or not it's your foot when you're walking or your snowboard when you're making massive carved turns. So expert riders can also use speed, turn shape, timing, as well as harnessing some other physics from the ground and ground reaction forces to make their riding a lot more easy and effortless. And so hopefully that gives a little bit more of a picture of what we're looking at. And then also some cues about how you can work with your novice riders in the positions they get into and work them along the way to become more expert riders. And so next slide, please. So hopefully today we covered it through that 5-question workshop of the level 2. We covered off what are the center of mass and the base of support, not just from a textbook angle, but actually from a real life example, understanding a little bit more about how this actually can be used to create snowboarding rather than just thinking about it as like some random physics principle that you don't need to know. We've also really highlighted, hopefully, how regulating edge angle actually has the most impact on stability. We learned how that by creating instability in the center of mass, this can help us to become more efficient snowboarders. And the idea that keeping more of our mass, our big joints of snowboarding, our arms, our shoulders, hips, butt, and knees, closer to the center line on both heel edge and toe edge, can aid us in being able to be more adaptable and dynamically stable riders, because it allows us to keep our joints in a really middle range of movement for optimal muscle performance. And we know a little bit more about the fact that most of our muscles, key muscles of snowboarding, cross multiple joints. And so what, flexes your knee also, has a lot of impact on what's going on at your hip. What flexes your toes up and down also has a lot of impact on how stable your knees are. And hopefully this sets you guys up for thinking a little bit more, getting those brains moving as we start to all get on snow and look towards getting onto snow when it, a little bit more accumulates in the next couple of months. So I'm going to open up the floor to any questions that may have popped up.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, throw them in the chat there. Definitely some good info for sure there. So for me, the big one is sort of rethinking the concept of base of support and applying it more to the amount of edge or the amount of the base that you're using to get that stability, rather than just simply sort of thinking of base of support flowing from front foot to back foot. So,
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good one, right? Like there's so many planes of balance with that. Front foot to back foot's a big part of it, but edge-wise is a big one. And it answers some reasons why we really focus on center pivot and balance along the working edge being core competencies when it comes to snowboarding.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, you're right, probably the biggest effect on any rider really that affects their stability is amount of edge angle.
Yeah. And snow conditions, but you can't change that either.
Exactly. Yeah. Cool. Well, things must have been pretty clear. Oh, here's a question. All right. Here we go.
Good. Oh, yes.
Oh, this is a great question from Ontario. What is this powder you're referring to?
So when the groomer comes along and fluffs up all the snow and makes it nice and fluffy, yeah, that falls from the sky sometimes. It happens in Ontario too, but yeah, you'll get a bigger base of support whether or not you're on fresh groomer, because that puts air into the system and allows your snowboard to sort of like sink into that a little bit more, rather than just bouncing off of that wonderful hard pack that we all love.
And then I have a direct message to me, but it's a good question as well. So how does back foot binding angle, set positive or negative, help or hinder movement to maintain proper balance?
Nice. So that's a really good one. So setting up that back foot, one of the key, did we talk about, was it heel edge in particular or in general?
Just in general, I think. Yeah.
Just in general? Okay. Well, I'm going to address it a little bit more on a heel edge. And if we want to roll back to the slide with the 2 snowboarders in the advanced position, setting up that back foot in such a way that you can have ankle mobility is really, really important. I think that's going to be the biggest one. There's no, I wouldn't say there's a prescribed angle to where it is, but what needs to happen is you're in a place where the back foot and the back ankle can still move, allow the shin to move forward, because that's probably the biggest mover to try and get the butt over top of the tail of the snowboard a little bit more, to keep the hips in a really good end range. So when you're setting up that snowboard and when you're trying stuff out early in the season, make sure that you have ankle mobility in that back foot, and that your back foot ankle or angle allows you to move your ankle. Good question. Really good question.
One more that came in here again from Taz. Specifically, when working with a novice who's maxed out, what do you feel is a solid tactic for helping them into a more efficient range, especially when they're exhausting themselves in those maxed out positions?
Yeah, right. I always prescribe changing, taking the tactic or the terrain back to a task that's slightly easier. So a slightly easier terrain for a beginner is going to give them a larger base of support. You know, slope wise, if they can't control the edge angle quite so much, larger base of support is going to allow them to feel a little bit more stable and maybe be a little bit more relaxed and prevent them from maxing out those joints. Also, another option for them if they're feeling really exhausted is to, if they're say in a heelside side slip, step it back one and take that back foot out and go back to a 1 foot side slip. That'll allow them to shift from foot to foot as their quads or their hips get tired, and start to assume a more natural athletic position because it's just standing.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything to add there, Jeff?
Just, I think that point there about just recognizing the point where effort is outweighing result and scaling back terrain, right? Or changing the environment. And you can see it in a beginner's face, right? Before
Yeah.
And so it's recognizing that point where you're, you know, that maxed out sort of, it can be physical, but it can also be mental or psychological, which is probably a separate Zoom call, but and taking steps to alleviate that before it becomes you know, right at the end range of what they can handle by, like you said, getting them back on flatter terrain, letting them take their back foot out for some added stability, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
A couple more questions here. High back lean. This is from Sharon. What would you suggest for a novice when it comes to forward lean, not to max them out?
Forward lean is a great one because so often people have that completely maxed out in one direction or the other, and I think that we roll back into the discussion that we just had about joints, maxing them out is a terrible idea. Somewhere in the middle is a great idea. So not in a place where it's, you know, absolutely closing their ankle completely. And then conversely, not allowing them to, you know, get to a place where they're completely trying to press back for a high back. There's no support for them at all. So finding a place that's in the middle for those novice riders that allows them to be in a place where they can be efficient. And if that means that it has to be like, you know, a little bit taller because they're going to stand a little higher because they don't have the range, that's okay. Sort of accepting too that they may end up at an end range sometimes, and that's going to be okay as well. But yeah, somewhere in the middle, you know, yeah, for forward lean.
We just got a comment from Clovis, and I noticed, Clovis, you have your hand raised as well. Maybe just, you can always unmute yourself if you have a question that you wanted to jump in with, but I noticed you also typed it into the chat. So just Clovis just said, love the part about falling, and you have to trust that fall in order to move forward, which is true, right? Like you said, let the ball come around.
Yeah, it's a huge one, right? And for anybody that's watched a child learn to walk for the first time, toddlers learn to walk, it takes them a lot to get used to that falling motion and trusting it that their foot's going to come forward, and it doesn't always go well. And so if we relate that idea of going back to snowboarding as like trusting that fall a little bit more, trusting it, And that's what I like about the quick ride, is that we have that in some really bite-sized chunks, like pendulum, or even like one-footed pendulum, because like drifting the snowboard from side to side, because it gives them that, you know, hand to hold, that little bit of extra stability to learn to trust.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just going back a little bit. Rob Stevens, I'm just going to read his comment. So internal versus external rotation when drawing the bum in, regarding internal rotation, maxing out the SI joint, even though tucking the bum underneath or in feels good.
Yeah, so definitely thinking, yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts on that one. So like really, when we're talking about tucking the bum, I like pelvis rotation on the spine is something that we don't want to max out either, right? If you tuck by tipping the pelvis backwards, you place the SI joints in a really unstable position. You place the lumbar spine in a really unstable position on the tailbone and the sacrum. So I'm gonna like edit the sort of tucking the bum idea in, that it's not so much to do with a rotation of the hip joint, but instead keeping as neutral to, you know, using range that you've got. And then, but more along lines of engaging ankle to draw the bum forward, to draw and tuck the bum under, rather than an actual pelvic roll underneath. Yeah, anatomy and physiology up next.
Nice. And then looks like maybe one more here. How about nose and tail manipulation and body shifting that center of mass, like in park environments for jumps and tricks and such?
Oh, heck yeah. You know, we do that with street style entries onto a feature, right? You're coming into a feature, you shift your center of mass first, and then you bring your base of support underneath you and you lock yourself onto that feature. So it's a great way to think about, you know, the physics of getting yourself onto a feature first, move the center of mass to where you want to be, and then it's a really effective movement, and it's going to lock you in and make it along that feature. Same idea with throwing any sort of movement patterns back and forth along nose and tail is, again, those are effective ways to move the center of mass first to create force. So it's something that's really well harnessed with park riding. And probably see it in like novice riders to, you know, expert riders in the park. Novice riders are going to use that brute force and ignorance. Expert riders make it look good. How'd they do that? Center of mass, base of support.
Cool. And then sort of relating to the last point here, but following on Alex's point, other than in the park, would there be a good situation to max out a joint?
I think the answer is like understanding that there's pros and cons to that. I mean, if you got to save yourself from hitting a tree, it's probably going to help you out. But you're probably going to want to pull into a more neutral position after you avoid the tree. You know,
yeah, so the first thing that jumps into mind for me as well is just exactly what you just said. Is like it's that concept that there's always consequences, and so you might be chasing certain feelings in your snowboarding. I know that I do certain things on my board from time to time that aren't necessarily the most sound when it comes to physics and biomechanics, but the feelings that you get from them are pretty cool. So that's, I think, the good thing about snowboarding. But yeah. Right.
Like, and you can't do a laid out Eurocarve without maxing a couple of joints. So right? So it's all about what you want to have and how you can use that to enjoy snowboarding and use the range that you have, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the last one here from Graham definitely seems like magic. Can you explain the physics of a beautiful, tweaked out, horizontally laid out method, or is it just magic?
It is not magic, it's physics. But I'm sure that there is someone who's constructed a mathematical model for the beautiful laid out method. There's some really, really fabulous nerdy stuff on the internet. It's worth looking for. Yeah, I'd love to see the coefficient of drag on takeoff for that one. That'd be a fun one. It's not magic though. Good question, Graham.
Nice. Well, thanks everyone. It looks like the questions have stopped rolling in, and thanks, Melon.
Thanks, Jeff.
Guys, yeah, no problem. Thank you. That was great.
Yeah,
so,
and thanks.
Yeah, watch for the next member session coming hopefully next month. Also, well, by next month, November, some of our programs will be starting to roll in the western part of the country, in Alberta anyway. So things like, well, courses, member sessions, Trainer Update is a new program that we launched last year that will start to show up on the schedule in Alberta starting in November, and that's open to all level 2s who are maybe in a training role and looking for a level 1 and 2 update. So look for the Trainer Update. Just remember that as a CASI member, you're entitled to a free member session every year as well. And that member session program has been expanded this year with some additional topics for those full day training days. So a couple of the ones that we're going to try to include on the schedule this year deal with kind of tools or a toolbox building day geared towards skill development around the level 2 level, but improving your toolbox around skill development. So exercises for position and balance, for example, pivot, edge, all that sort of stuff. And then also a carving focus day that you should see on the schedule. But programs are on the schedule now at the website, and so we're getting pretty close to the winter season. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming and listening and learning, and hope to see you on snow sometime this year. Be awesome.
Sure. All right, thanks guys.
Thanks.